All right. So we're recording here. So let's take a look. Today is the 7th. I extended the due date for this one till Friday at 11:59 p.m. So it was not due just now like it was originally scheduled in the syllabus. The date on Blackboard should say April 9th, 11:59 p.m. So there's that one. Chapter 9 quiz. I did post that one Monday. So that one should be there. And I will be posting your final master and his emissary quiz this afternoon. And it will be due, the plan is a week from today at the beginning of class. And that will be the last master and his emissary quiz. I have posted a new master and his emissary mini lecture, and I posted the link on Blackboard for language, truth, and music. So I got a couple more to go here before I'm done with those mini lectures. This is the first time I've done that. I mentioned this before. For this class in the past, I didn't really talk too much about the book in the class or have any kind of additional information other than meeting with students to talk about their papers if they chose. I am having those lectures now regarding each chapter to kind of help you brainstorm ideas and to kind of process each chapter. And yes, I just finished language, truth, and music. And I'll just say those, they're taking a lot longer per each one. The language, truth, and music mini lecture, I call it mini lecture, is only 40 minutes long, which is kind of short in terms of lectures. But there's probably 10 to 12 hours of planning or 10 to 12 hours of preparation just to give that lecture. And there's something about the Master and Emissary lectures where I record them and then I mess up a whole, like more than I'm used to messing up. Like usually I can do these lectures live and it's not big of a problem. Master and Emissary, it's something hard about that. I haven't really put my finger on it. Those are just harder. So I just wanted to share that with you. They're a little bit harder, take a long time to prep, but it is there. And I do think that it will be helpful for planning those papers. It definitely should be helpful for you brainstorming ideas for the paper and just understanding kind of the book in some ways. I mean, I don't go into every single detail of the book because I want you to read it yourself, but there's definitely some information there that I think will be helpful, especially for understanding some of those big picture ideas that are in the book. Any general questions or comments about assignments, things coming up in the future? Let's see. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. It does look like your writing assignment is currently, Master's Emissary writing assignment is currently planned to be due exactly a month from today. So I guess that would be, 4 weeks, 28 days is when that will be due, May 5th. If there are no questions or comments regarding assignments, then we'll just go into finishing chapter 6. I strongly believe we will finish chapter 6 today because there's only really 1 or 2 things to talk about. And we'll get started on chapter 7, attention. This is where we left off. I do want to review this a little bit. I kind of rushed through this last time. And I wanted to talk about it just a tiny bit more. And so this is chapter 6 on object perception. I mentioned it's part of the 2-part kind of series of chapters. Chapter 5, mostly on sensation. The bottom upside, the beginning of the beginning of the process. Chapter 6 is more like the later aspects of the process: perception, interpretation, object recognition. The parts of the brain, like the dorsal and ventral pathway, which occur after primary visual cortex. Primary visual cortex, that stuff in the occipital lobe, that's more on the sensation side of thing. That stuff is activated soon after visual information reaches your eyes. Those occipital areas are activated relatively first, and then the information is sent to those 2 pathways. The ventral pathway is involved with recognizing an object, which I've defined as like being able to name an object and being able to describe verbally what that object does. That's object recognition. And then the dorsal or where pathway, it's about spatial perception, knowing where objects are in space so that you can interact with them. And really the interaction part is the key aspect of the dorsal or the where, the parietal pathway, the kinesthetic codes, the activation of the motor system so you can somehow interact with an object which is out there in the world. Those are sort of the later interpretive, perceptual things. They're later physically in the brain. V1, primary visual cortex, activated first. Then those two pathways are activated later. There's kind of two aspects of processing objects, recognizing objects in the visual pathway and interacting with objects, the kinesthetic codes, the motor codes in the dorsal or aware pathway. We've talked a lot about those. And then we have just a couple little more things to talk about regarding here, the ventral pathway. So recognizing objects. The two types of objects which you talked about here are faces and words. And we're talking about this area, the fusiform area again, fusiform area, which is part of the temporal lobe. Therefore, it's part of the ventral pathway. And the idea is that faces and words are types of objects. We especially might not think of words as like a type of object, but in the brain, they appear to be processed in the same, the ventral pathway, like other objects are recognized. Words are recognized in a similar type of way. But there's a hemispheric asymmetry here, and we've actually talked about these hemispheric asymmetries in different chapters. Master and his emissary talks about them, so you should be kind of familiar with these ideas by now. In general, there's faces activate both left and right hemispheres of the brain, of the ventral pathway of the fusiform area in particular, which is inferior part of the temporal lobe, the bottom part. But there's more activation in the right hemisphere than there is in the left. It's bilateral activation, but there's more activation in the right fusiform area, the right ventral pathway for faces, than there is the left ventral pathway. Words, on the other hand, is just the opposite. Words, they do activate both hemispheres of the brain, but there is significantly stronger activation in the visual word form area, which is the left fusiform area. And I've mentioned in a previous chapter that words, if you have damage to the left visual word, the left fusiform area, the visual word form area, that oftentimes will cause acquired alexia, which is kind of like dyslexia. If you have brain damage or a lesion to the visual word form area, a person who previously is able to sight read words normally, you can read all these words on the page without really thinking about it too much. After that damage, will read more like someone who never really learned to read or is not skilled at reading. Person with acquired alexia has damage to the left visual word form area, will have to sound out many of the words, especially longer words or less familiar words are more likely to have to be kind of sounded out. They kind of lose that automaticity for reading words that a person who has their visual word form area intact, which is working, they're still working, has. So people with intact visual word form areas can read words very quickly, automatically. Damage to that causes acquired alexia, which can impair that automaticity. Looks like we have a question or comment. Let's take a look. If I said, so the question is the left fusiform area part of the temporal lobe, but with dorsal pathway? If I said dorsal pathway, that was definitely an error. If ventral pathway is what, if I said dorsal pathway, that would have definitely been an error. The temporal lobe is part of the ventral pathway, and the fusiform area, the faces, the words, these are processed primarily in the ventral pathway. If I said dorsal pathway, that would have been did I say dorsal pathway? I'm not seeming to get an answer, but if I said dorsal pathway, I do apologize. It's definitely oh, you just confused. No problem. Yeah, I appreciate the question. Yeah, these are fusiform area, temporal lobe, which is part of the ventral pathway, the what pathway. Use the what pathway to recognize what you're looking at, a face, and whose face it is. You use the ventral pathway, the what pathway, to recognize what word you are reading, what word you're looking at. I have a little bit more on this. I showed you this yesterday. So this is a brain right here that you're looking in from the front. And so this is actually the right hemisphere. This is actually the left. I think they call this a coronal section of the brain. You're looking in from the front. And these little splotches represent regions of the brain which are more strongly activated to faces than to either these other types of objects, or these are areas of activation which are more strongly activated in faces relative to these scrambled kind of weird looking faces right here. And for both situations, the faces relative to their comparison, there's two different comparisons, the objects versus the scrambled faces, activate both areas of the brain. And you can see this is the inferior, it's lower part of the cortex. This is the inferior temporal lobe, or the fusiform area of both hemispheres. So it's bilateral activation, though the activation is stronger in the right hemisphere right here. So this supports this idea that we've read about now and heard about in several chapters. I think the last one might have been chapter 4, that faces are, and in Master Nizam, I talk about this as well, faces rely a little bit more strongly on the right hemisphere than they do the left, and the right fusiform, the right ventral pathway, to be more specific. Here is some stuff about words. So this one's a little bit tricky. So as I told you a little bit about it last time, and I'll talk about it a little bit again. So there's 2 brain regions which are being talked about here. I think that's one of the things which is tricky. The one that's most relevant to what I've been talking about just now, the left fusiform area, that's part of the ventral pathway, is up top here. And then V4, which is kind of closer, that's part of the occipital lobe. That's more in the sensory side of things. It's like an earlier brain region. It's adjacent to V1, V4 and V1, both in the occipital lobe and the back of the brain. They're kind of right next to each other, some of the earlier brain regions that are activated. And the response profile of the visual word form area, the left fusiform gyrus to words, is a little bit different than the response profile to V4. That's why this picture is kind of interesting. It's because, well, we've learned in general that there's kind of this contralateral organization of the brain, where things in the left side of space tend to go to the right hemisphere of the brain, and things in the right side of space tend to go to the left hemisphere of the brain. That is quite true for V4. And you can see it right here when there's the stimulated hemifield, which means the hemifield just means visual field. Hemifield does not mean hemisphere. Hemifield means the part of visual space out there in the world. When the left visual field is activated, then in V4, this is the right hemisphere now. So it's another tricky thing about this. Now for these brains, we're looking in from the back of the brain. You're looking into the back of a person's brain. So it's like you're looking into the back of their body, the back of their brain. So now this is the right hemisphere. This is the left. This is the right hemisphere. This is the left. The left visual field for this person is stimulated. So the stimulus is over there. And the V4, that early visual area in the occipital lobe, it's contralateral. If the left visual field is stimulated, then the right hemisphere of the brain, the right V4, is activated. Just the opposite over here for still V4. If the right visual field, the right side of space, presents a word, if that's where the object appears, the word appears, is over there, then it is the left hemisphere, V4, which is activated right there. So this is part of the occipital lobe. These in general, that contralateral organization of the brain occurs for these is more likely to occur for those early sensory processes than for later processes. And I say that because recognizing an object is a relatively later process. It is more of a higher order, top-down type of thing. The ventral pathway is a later process. And when we're looking at these later processes, the evidence suggests that there isn't really this crossing from one visual field to the contralateral hemisphere. At least it's not quite as strong, and there's really no evidence of it at all when we're looking at the left fusiform gyrus, the visual word form area. So once again, a word is presented to the left visual field or the right visual field. And either case, the thing which is stimulated is the left fusiform area. The visual word form area is stimulated so the left hemisphere visual word form area is stimulated when a stimulus is presented in the left visual field. And the left fusiform area, the visual word form area, is stimulated when the word is presented in the right visual field. So this is like a part of the brain where the activity in this part of the brain is not strongly influenced by where the stimulus is presented, compared to these early regions, which are strongly influenced. These are contralateral. These activations shown right here, right in the blue and the red, those are contralateral, the opposite of whatever visual field the stimulus is presented in. But this relatively later activation in the visual word form area, which is where part of the brain where words seem to be recognized in the ventral pathway, this activation is strong relatively strong in the left hemisphere of the brain, visual orbital area, the left inferior fusiform area, part of the ventral. What pathway? No matter which hemifield the stimulus is presented in. So that's kind of in general, the principle, I guess, is early areas are more likely to have that crossing, whereas the late areas like fusiform area are less likely to have that kind of contralateral crossing. So yes, that is my review. That's a review. So one last thing in this chapter, then we'll move on to chapter 7. Mind reading, which is an interesting, relatively new technology, which gets better as computer processing gets better. So when we're talking about mind reading or statistical pattern recognition, the researchers are always measuring brain activity with one of the neuroimaging methods. Oftentimes it is fMRI or EEG, because those are just kind of the two of probably the most popular common neuroimaging methods. And the participant is processing some type of an object. They're looking at an object here. They have people looking at either like an apartment building or a picture of a face, which activates these kind of different networks of the brain. One object kind of activates one set of regions in the brain. A different object will activate a different set of regions of the brain. And statistical pattern recognition mind reading is the idea that now computers can process all of that neural information pretty quickly and can kind of tell you or tell the researcher what it is that the participant is looking at just by looking at the brain. So you could do something where the researcher is not looking at the stimuli at all. The participant is looking at stimuli, and the participant on a given trial looks at a stimulus, and let's say it's that apartment building, and that apartment building goes into their eyes, and then it activates all these different parts of the brain. The researcher doesn't know what stimulus the participant's looking at. The researcher is just looking at the neural data, whether it's a bunch of EEG electrical activity or whether it's fMRI, which shows those different voxels which have metabolic activity or bold response, blood flow. The researcher is just looking at the brain activity. And actually, it's not even really the researcher which is looking at the brain activity. It's a computer which is looking at the brain activity. And then the computer, which is programmed to some extent by the researcher, can output, oh, right now, the participant is looking at the apartment. The computer knows this because the apartment kind of has its unique signature of brain activity through learning, like I guess you call artificial intelligence. The computer can learn, oh, when the person is looking at the apartment, this is what their brain looks like. When the participant is looking at a face, this is what their brain looks like. When the participant's looking at a word, this is what their brain looks like. And then the computer or the researcher stops looking at those stimuli when the participant's actually looking at them. It's just measuring or looking at the brain activity. And it can measure or look at the brain activity and then output, oh, on this trial, the participant is looking at an apartment building. On this trial, the participant's looking at a face. And this is why it's mind reading, because you're just looking at the mental activity of the brain, measured either with EEG, fMRI, maybe some of the other ones like PET or MEG. You're just looking at the mental activity, the neural activity itself. You're not actually you're not looking at the stimulus if you're the researcher or the computer. Nevertheless, you as the computer or the researcher are able to learn through repetition, this is what the brain looks like when they're looking at these things. And eventually the computer can tell what the person is looking at, even just by the brain activity alone. That's what mind reading is. Statistical pattern. The statistical pattern which is being recognized is kind of the signature of brain activity that occurs in response to a given object compared to other types of objects. And this is cool, and it's a cool technology because, well, in particular for the individuals with this locked-in syndrome, which is down here. So I'll go through these are different states of consciousness. Locked-in syndrome is probably the most serious. Vegetated state or coma is, of course, serious as well. But the difference here, so in a vegetated state or a coma, there's really not any evidence that the participant or that the patient, I guess I should say at this point, is conscious. In a vegetated state or coma, the person might have some basic rudimentary reflexes, which are probably using subcortical regions of the brain, which have some basic reflexes, but there's really not too much evidence that the person's conscious. So the person might move a little bit in response to stimulus, but there's really not any evidence that the person is experiencing things consciously. And that's because the person's showing no behavioral signs of consciousness. So that's a coma. And it's a serious condition. But I guess the good news is that the person is not conscious. I mean, it could be considered a good thing, I guess. Well, compared to locked-in syndrome, which is well, you'll see. It's a kind of scary condition, I guess I'll say. Minimally conscious state. This is when a patient does show some behavioral signs of consciousness, oftentimes in a minimally conscious state. So this would be like, after you've come out of a coma for whatever reason. So if you have a head injury, you're in a coma for a while, your body starts to heal, your brain starts to heal, and you'll kind of come in and out of a minimally conscious state is kind of characterized by kind of being conscious for a while, showing signs of consciousness, being able to look around, maybe some rudimentary communication with people around you, but then slipping back into a coma, and then coming back a little bit. So it's kind of in and out of consciousness, and nothing's really constant. When you're conscious, you are able to move around a little bit. You're showing some evidence that you're experiencing things consciously. And this is, usually considered part of the healing process. And if you get to here, this is a good sign. Locked-in syndrome, at least I've always thought this is a scary thing, that it's a possible thing that can happen. And I guess it's less scary now. It would have been much more scary before mind reading technology, before statistical pattern recognition occurred. Locked-in syndrome, the person is awake, the patient is awake or conscious, they're experiencing things, but they're paralyzed. They show no behavioral signs of consciousness because they are paralyzed. Nevertheless, they are awake. So if a person can't move at all, their eyes might be open. It might look like they're just in a coma. Vegetated state sometimes, or coma, the eyes might be kind of open, but but it's still not conscious. And you're not showing for a coma, you're not showing any behavioral signs of consciousness because you can't move, and you're not conscious. But sometimes you might look almost the exact same, locked-in syndrome, but the patient is conscious. So there's no behavioral signs of consciousness. They're not moving at all. They're not able to interact with people around them. Even their eyes don't really move much other than kind of the reflexive movements of the eyes, and which are not considered a behavioral signature or behavioral sign of consciousness. There's body paralysis for the most part, except for maybe the eyes might move just a little bit, but it's not like the participant does not seem to have much control over their own eye movement. It would mostly be like reflexive eye movements. And so for locked-in syndrome, the new technology, the mind reading technology, allows researchers to kind of communicate with these patients. And the way that works is that they train the patients. So these patients can't move, but their brain is working. They're conscious, and their brain appears to still respond differently depending on what type of an object the person is looking at. So even if you're in locked-in syndrome, you can't move, but your brain, it still processes different types of objects differently depending on what it is you're looking at. I do see that question. Let me just finish talking here and then I'll look at it. And so the reason why this is helpful is they can teach the participant that whenever they can teach a person, okay, they can first train a statistical, a computer learning program, an artificial intelligence kind of computer learning program. This is what the patient's brain looks like when they're looking at object X. And imagine object X. I think I've seen they oftentimes will have the picture of a person playing tennis. That will be like object. I'll call it object A instead. So object A. There's object A. If we ask you a question, the answer is yes. Think about the person playing tennis. That means when you think about the person playing tennis, that means if we've asked you a question, the answer to that question is yes. And then there'll be some other object, which would be imagine a picture of a shirt. And that would be if you think of a shirt, that means the answer is no. And they use things that are very different because they don't want the person to accidentally think of a shirt when they're thinking yes. So very different types of person playing tennis versus like a shirt or something like that, or a person playing tennis and like a lamp. So different types of objects. if the person playing tennis is what the patient thinks about, if the answer is yes, and a lamp or a shirt, something else is what the participant thinks about when the answer is no, the statistical artificial intelligence can decide, oh, okay, they just asked the person a question. They might ask the person a question like, are you in pain? And that's obviously a question. If you are in a locked in state, you can't move, you can't communicate with the people around you verbally, you can't move, and you're in pain, that would just be torturous. And so that's an important question for the locked in person to be able to communicate to people, because if they're in pain, the doctors can do something to help. So they ask that question. And if the patient thinks of the tennis player, that means yes, they're in pain. And the doctors could either ask more questions to figure out like where the pain is, or they can, give pain medicine or whatever to make the patient feel better. Or if they ask the person if you're in pain, and they think of something else like a shirt or a lamp, that means the answer is no. And then that's good. And so it's a way of communicating with simple yes or no questions. The patient thinks of something that they have looked at previously, and one thing means yes, the other thing means no. And it's a way of communicating. Let's look at these questions / comments. I don't know the exact, so question is, what are the instances where locked-in syndrome may occur? I think usually it occurs after brain damage, but I don't know what types of brain damage are actually likely to cause this. I imagine that doctors are doing research on this exact thing, because you as a doctor you could kind of look at the person's brain with an fMRI, and you can maybe notice, oh, this region of the brain is lesioned. This means that the person is probably not conscious at all. Or this other region of the brain is lesioned. This means the person might be conscious, they're just paralyzed. So I think usually it occurs after brain damage, but I do not think that I don't know if doctors have really nailed down which regions of the brain when they're injured are most likely to cause locked-in syndrome. I'm not aware of that for sure. There's probably ongoing research, and then I imagine experts on this have theories as to which brain regions are most important. I'd say usually though it occurs after brain damage of some sort, maybe some type of chemical, if you're like poisoned or something like that, it could happen as well. The site just looked at, you said the pons. The pons for which one? The pons is, if you have injury to the pons, that causes a coma, does it not? The pons is part of the brain stem, and that makes sense. It makes sense that subcortical areas would be important, but yeah, this student's saying that the pons is important for this, but I don't know if the injury to the pons is more likely to cause locked-in syndrome, or if it's more likely to cause a coma. I'm not for sure. And I'm usually a little skeptical of just reading stuff on the internet as well, but that makes sense that the pons, the subcortical area, would be important for, these very basic functions related to consciousness nonetheless. Another question, where does catatonia fall under? So catatonia is related usually, I think, to schizophrenia, right? That's when people don't move with schizophrenia. That's more of like I believe, an emotional condition, catatonia. And it's kind of a controversial one if I understand it correctly. I would say catatonia, the people are not actually paralyzed in any physical sense. It's more of like an emotional paralysis. And for instance, I'd imagine people with catatonia can still, they're not considered locked in. Psychiatrists or doctors are worried about individuals with catatonia, but it's definitely like a different type of worrying. It's a different type of concern than it is for patients with locked-in syndrome. But that's a really interesting connection. I've never thought about that relationship. Another question, can anything be done to help when someone is in locked-in syndrome? Yeah, probably. I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know exactly what they're doing right now to help. I mean, it's not a good situation to be in. I believe usually they kind of wait, and the body can heal, kind of it's on its own. And then there might be types of rehab that can be done that can eventually cause you to get better. I don't know, my intuition, and I haven't heard tons and tons and tons and tons of instances of this. Kind of my feeling based on what I have seen, which is, I have to admit, is a lot of like on YouTube and stuff, is that most of the people that get into the locked-in situation, they don't like usually fully recover and have like normal lives after that. Usually once you get to the locked-in situation, that's usually, things are not going to be good for a long time. That's my intuition. Medical doctors would be a neurologist or something would be much more of an expert on this particular question. So I'd say there's not much you can do other than wait. There might be some medicines, there might be some types of therapies you can do, but I don't think there's much you can do for locked-in syndrome. How would you determine if someone has locked-in syndrome versus coma if they appear similarly? Yeah, so that's the whole point of mind reading. If they have a coma, their eyes are looking out, and you show them the apartment. You show them a person playing tennis, and then you show them a shirt or something, or you show them a lamp. And then later on, you ask them, okay, are you in pain? And then they don't think, and then the mind reading, the computers are looking at their brain, and the computer's trying to determine, is this person thinking of a tennis player, or are they thinking of a shirt? Is the answer yes, or is the answer no? And if the person's in a vegetated state, the brain is not going to go to either of those things, because you're using your consciousness to kind of think about something. I'm going to think about tennis, or I'm going to think about a shirt, yes or no. And if you're in a vegetated state, if you're in a coma, you're not conscious, so your brain isn't going to go there. When you're not going to think about either one when you're asked a question. You can't visualize things in your mind when your mind is unconscious. So that's how you do it. If a person's locked in, they look the same. They're trained to look. They've looked at these different pictures: a person playing tennis versus a shirt. Those are the yes or no. And then the doctor asks a question: yes or no, are you in pain? If the answer is yes, then the patient can use their consciousness to think of a person playing tennis. If the answer is no, then they can use their consciousness to think about a shirt. So only the people with locked-in syndrome are able to visualize something. Only the people with locked-in syndrome have consciousness. People with vegetative state don't. Only the people with locked-in syndrome have consciousness that allows only people with locked-in syndrome have the consciousness that allows them to modulate their own brain activity. So one student said, one study said motor recovery rate for locked-in syndrome is around 21%. So that is, that's better than zero, but that's not exactly like, I don't know, if you have locked-in syndrome, that's not exactly like optimistic news or great news to have to learn that only 21% or so, 20% of the individuals recover. So yeah, as I said, it's a pretty serious condition once you get there. There might be some recovery, usually probably requires a long amount of time for your body to heal. Good, these are awesome questions. So let's continue on though. That is it for chapter 6. Yeah, that's it for chapter 6. You guys asked good questions in that one. Now on to chapter 7. Which concerns attention. And I'll remind you that one of the major concepts of Master and his Emissary, the kind of other major reading in this book, in this class, is attention. In the first 2 chapters, he talks a lot about how the fundamental difference between the 2 hemispheres is the type of attention that they give to the world. And this is a concept which kind of goes out, it continues a lot through the entire Master and his Emissary. So this is definitely one of those concepts which is there's a lot of strong connections between the textbook and Master's Emissary. Of course, the lecture that I'm going to do on attention today, some of it is based on stuff which is in the textbook. For this lecture in particular, I am definitely taking a lot of things from like my own research and readings related in particular to the EEG research regarding attention, and some articles that I've read on my own that aren't part of the textbook. So a lot of this is taken from, that I'm going to talk about is taken from the textbook, but some of it is not. There are definitely some overlap and some points of differences, though, in the way that the authors of the 2 books approach attention. And so attention is one of these things, though, that usually when you think about it as a student, your kind of day-to-day definition of attention is pretty accurate. Here's the definition: idea you have all these different things out in the world that you can be attending to, and a synonym would be focusing in on. Attention is the ability to select or to choose a subset of those things out in the world to kind of enhance your focus on them, which kind of comes at the cost. You tend to ignore the stuff that you're not focused in on, the stuff that you're not attending to. So the textbook has these distinction between these things, and we will talk a little bit about the distinction between these two terms. Um, Master's Emissary talks about these as well. Master's Emissary, I think, does talk about voluntary, also known as endogenous attention, versus involuntary reflexive attention a little bit. Um, but I'd say these are actually, they're talked about some in Master's Emissary, but this is actually, these little terms, these terms right here, are probably slightly more of a difference than they are a similarity between the two authors. The textbook focuses more on these things, whereas Master's Emissary doesn't really focus on these terms that much. Nevertheless, I'll talk about them. Covert versus overt. So covert attention is the idea that you can focus in on something even if you're not looking directly at it. Or with the sense of audition, like when you're hearing, covert attention would be like if you're kind of engaged with the conversation over here, but then you shift your attention so that you're starting to listen in on a conversation which is going over here, which means you're not really paying attention to the person who's right here. You're using your covert attention. Covert kind of means hidden. It looks like you're paying attention to this person, but you're actually maybe paying attention to a conversation which is over there. That would be a style of covert attention. But visually, covert attention would be like if my eyes are looking this way, but I'm paying attention to something which is like in my peripheral vision. That would be covert, hidden attention. Overt is just the opposite. Overt is the idea that I'm paying attention to something by looking directly at it. Or I'm talking to this person, I'm using my overt attention if I'm paying attention to what the person I'm, interacting with. My ears are facing that person and I'm also listening to them. My eyes are facing that person. I'm also looking at them. That would be overt attention. It's not hidden. It's very obvious. The thing the thing that my sensory receptors are facing is the thing that I'm paying attention to. So that's kind of one definition. Voluntary, also known as endogenous attention. This is the idea that you, as a conscious being, are able to kind of shift your attention voluntarily based on where you want your attention to go. Involuntary attention, also known as exogenous, I like this term reflexive, is the idea that sometimes things kind of capture your attention. So for instance, like visually, if you're paying attention and then there's like, you see like someone, if you're like in the library or something, you're paying attention, but then in your peripheral vision, you see someone like running across the library. That's kind of an unusual thing. That might kind of capture your attention. It might temporarily kind of distract you away from the book you're trying to read or concentrate on, or whatever, the computer you're trying to concentrate on. Someone running across, that's kind of a salient thing that you don't see that very often in the library. That might kind of temporarily distract you, and your mind kind of is taken over there by the fact that it's like a reflex. You see something unusual or you see something salient, meaning, very obvious, very, another example would be like if you see something very like a bright flash or something. That's the type of like you're doing something and all of a sudden you see something very like big or bright or fast or something that is not what that's unusual compared to what you're kind of used to when you're in that situation. That anything which is kind of unusual to the norm, like a person running through the library or a bright flash, those are the types of things that can kind of steal your attention. That would be involuntary or reflexive. I like the reflexive, really helps me understand that it's like a reflex, someone's running along, you're looking here, someone runs along, you kind of reflexively, your attention will be kind of stolen in that direction, versus endogenous or voluntary. Endogenous, the endo part, refers to the fact that the source of attention is coming inside. Endo refers to like inside the mind. The person who's the conscious being, the person whose mind it is using their own consciousness to move their attention wherever they choose voluntarily. Versus involuntarily, it's kind of stolen by some salient thing. Another example, I should give an example auditorily for this. If you're trying to listen to someone, and then there's like, a good example, which would be like, if there's like a phone ringing in class, that kind of temporarily will take your auditory attention away from the teacher that you're trying to listen to. Or more extreme, if you're like trying to pay attention to someone listening and then there's like fireworks or something, which is very loud, even if it's just like a single firework, that'll temporarily like kind of steal your attention away from the thing that you're trying to pay attention to to the loud, unusual, salient thing that had just occurred. So these are some basic definitions of attention. We'll go into more detail about some cognitive neuroscience research and some behavioral research regarding especially these right here, voluntary and some on involuntary attention. I actually, before I get to the neuro stuff, I wanted to talk some about some of the behavioral research on attention, just because it's neat. So this stuff is usually taught in cognitive psychology. This is a cognitive neuroscience course, so it seems appropriate. If I can recall, this particular paradigm, this behavioral paradigm, is actually not taught in your textbook, but I think it's really helpful for kind of understanding some of the different like theories and basic ideas regarding the research and attention. So there's the shadowing task. It's a behavioral task. So you can use it to study the brain as well, but it's most usually just a behavioral task where the job of the participant in the shadowing task, they're actually listening. They have headphones on like this, and the two headphones have two different speech signals. So like over here, this is like person A saying something. And then over here, this is like person B saying something else. Or it might be the same person talking, but whatever, the speech sounds that are coming out of each ear are different. So it might be one sentence over here, and it might be a different sentence over here. And so it's usually dichotic listening. The stimuli are presented in both ears. Different stimuli are presented in each ear. In the shadowing task, your job is to focus in, to attend to one ear. So this is auditory attention. And this is, there's not too many examples of auditory attention in your cognitive neuroscience textbook, which is another reason why this is good to include, because it's a good example of auditory attention. You are paying attention to one ear, and your job as the participant is to repeat the speech sounds presented in that one ear. And so you ignore one ear and you're just paying attention to the one ear. And the way the researcher knows you're paying attention is because everything you hear this ear, you are saying out loud. You are repeating everything you hear. The only way you're going to be able to do that, pay attention to one ear while you are ignoring the other. Sorry, I'm getting hot. Okay, so these are kind of these two behavioral theories, early selection theory, and then I'll also talk about the late selection theory. And so the early selection theory, this is probably the most helpful kind of definitional thing. Information is selected by attention before the meaning is processed. And so what this means is that you are not going to like whatever the stimulus is out there, you're not going to, or if you're listening to something, you're not going to be able to process the meaning of the words that you are listening to unless you're paying attention to them. If you're not paying attention to something, then the signal is kind of blocked before your brain is able to process the meaning of something. The thing that you're ignoring, your brain blocks that signal, or that signal is not reaching the parts of your brain that process the meaning of the words. So the ignored thing, according to this early selection idea, will kind of block the signal of the thing that you're ignoring, and you'll never process the meaning of that signal. On contrast, according to this early selection theory, if you are paying attention to something, then that is the way that you can understand that. You can only understand the meaning of something if you are paying attention to it. That's early selection theory. So these examples are really helpful for understanding this. And both of these examples so these examples show right here that the sensory features of an ignored message. So when you're not paying attention to something, you can't detect the meaning of that something, according to the early selection theory, but you can detect the sensory features. So if you think about it, we've already talked about this, the sensory features of something, those are kind of the earliest responses in the brain are the sensory features. The later things are more likely to be processing the meaning of something, you know, what the object is, or what the sounds you are, what you're listening to, the meaning of those words. Those are later processes. The sensory features, for instance, we talked about primary auditory cortex. The A1, primary auditory cortex, processes sensory features, especially like the frequency or the pitch of the sounds that you are listening to. So early sensory features, more like the primary auditory areas. The meaning of those words are later auditory areas. And so according to this early selection theory, and there's some evidence, which is what I'm talking about here, the sensory features can be, you can process the sensory, the low level features of something, even if you're ignoring it. However, if you're ignoring something, you're not going to be able to process the meaning of those words. So they do this, the studies. So the way these kind of the paradigm for these shadowing tasks work is usually they're kind of tricking the participant a little bit. So they'll have you shadow. Remember, shadowing means you're paying attention to one ear, you're repeating everything that you hear in that one ear. But then usually the actual task that the researcher cares about was what you're able to process in the ear that you were ignoring. You were ignoring this ear over here. And in one experiment, in one study, in the ear that you're ignoring, let's say you're shadowing this ear, so you're paying attention to this ear, and you're hearing a person talk over here. This is the ear you are ignoring. And they do a study where in the ignored ear, the speaker, the person who is speaking over here changes from one biological sex, like a man to a woman, or from a woman to a man. And then they ask the participant, in that ear that you were ignoring, so we told you, the researcher said, I know we told you to pay attention to this ear, but we actually want to ask you a question about the ear that you were ignoring, this one over here. Did you notice anything change over here? Were there any changes that occurred in the ear that you were listening to? And when the thing that changes is the biological sex of the speaker in that ignored ear, participants are actually usually able to detect that. Please note that you do not need to process the meaning of the words that a person is saying to detect a change in their biological sex. In fact, go ahead and enter in the chat. What would be the sensory feature? So it'll be a low level sensory auditory feature that would allow you as a listener to distinguish between the two biological sexes usually. What sensory feature allows you to distinguish between the voices of men and women? Oh, you guys are getting this one fast, so let's take a look. Yep, pitch, 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 pitch. Everyone's getting this pitch. The fundamental frequency, men tend to have lower voices, women tend to have higher pitched voices. That is the tendency. And that is a sensory feature. So even when you're ignoring this ear, you can still detect the change that occurs in here when that change is sensory, like the pitch of the speaker's voice. So I'm paying attention here. There's a man over here, but then all of a sudden it changes to a higher pitched voice over here. Even though you're paying attention to over here, all of a sudden you might notice the change over here. Even though you're still paying attention over here, that change is so salient that even though you're not paying attention to it, you'll still notice it. And the research says, did you notice anything change in the ignored ear during the shadowing task? And the person says, yeah, it changed. The speaker changed. They can detect that change when it changes biological sex. That's very salient. And the idea is that you can still process sensory information like pitch, even if you're ignoring it. But they've done another study. So in this one right here, the second bullet point, the language that the ignored ear, there's a person over here and they might start speaking English, but then they start speaking Spanish, like halfway through. And you're asked the same question. You're shadowing this, and then you're done. And the researcher says, I know we had you shadowing, paying attention to this ear, but what we actually want to know is, did you notice any changes that occurred in that ignored ear? Now the change, the speaker's voice stayed the same, but the thing that changed was the language from English to Spanish or Spanish to English, or something like that. Did you detect any changes in the ear? And participants are significantly less likely to be able to detect this change in the language than this change in the pitch. And the idea is that if the language changes, that in one situation, you're able to process the meaning of the words, like in English, you'll all be able to process the meaning of its words. But if it changes to a language, well, I guess some of you guys might know Spanish. So let's say the second language, like English, and then it changes to like Russian or something. I imagine less of you guys probably know Russian than you do. Probably more people know Spanish than Russian. And so once you understand English words, but you might not understand Russian words. And so if you're processing the meaning of these things, you should be able to detect when the language changes, because you should be able to go, at one point you're able to understand the meaning of the words, but then they change to a language you don't know, and you're no longer able to detect the meaning of those words. You're no longer able to recognize the meaning. But people can't do that. When you're asked if the language changes, people are not very accurate at detecting that. Really good at detecting those sensory features. But when it's a language change, people aren't. And usually the explanation for this has to do with meaning. The ear that you're ignoring can still process those basic sensory features, low-level features. But the higher level features related to like recognizing the meaning of the words or recognizing the language of the words that are being spoken, that type of thing you can't do because it requires those later brain regions. The early brain regions are basically activated even if you're not paying attention to something. Those sensory brain regions are activated even if you're not paying attention to something. But if you're ignoring something, you can kind of think of it as that information will kind of get to those early brain regions and then it stops. It doesn't go beyond to the higher level perceptual interpretation areas of the brain. And so if you're ignoring something, you're not really able to process the meaning of that thing. That's the early selection theory. And then I want to talk about this one and we'll call it a day. So then there's the late selection theory, and the thing which, I guess these theories are in competition. There's evidence for each one. I just presented you the evidence in support of the early selection theory. In the ignored ear, people can detect changes in pitch, but they cannot detect changes in language, or they have trouble detecting changes in language, which is connected to the higher level regions of the brain. There is some evidence, though, that kind of goes against that. And that's this evidence here supports the late selection theory, which is in competition with that early selection theory. So the late selection theory suggests that the meaning of information, which is ignored, some of the meaning information is still being processed, even if you're ignoring the thing. So you can see these two theories are like completely opposite. The early selection theory says if you're ignoring something, you don't process the meaning at all. The late selection theory says if you're ignoring something, you still can process the meaning of the thing, at least to some extent. And so that's what the studies I'm talking about here. There's 2 or 3 examples that exist like out there, but I guess I just have 2 of them here. The most famous evidence for this is that if you're paying attention to this ear, people, you're listening, you're shadowing to this ear, you're repeating everything you hear in this ear. There's something else going on over here, another stream of speech over here. If part of the stream and the ignored speech is your name, so I'm listening over here, and then all of a sudden someone's like Matt Rosenthal over here, like I'll notice that. So please note though that the ability to recognize that the words I'm hearing in this ear are Matt Rosenthal, that requires kind of those later, you would think that it's requiring kind of those later processing regions, my ability to interpret a pattern of sound as a familiar word, my name. That's a type of meaning. It's a word with special meaning to me because it's my name. But people often are able to hear their own names in the ignored ear. So it like pops out to you. It's a type of meaning. It's like an example of a sound which is particularly meaningful to you that most people can still hear even when they're ignoring this ear. So that is evidence for late selection. At least some aspects of meaning are still being processed, specifically things like really important things like your name can still pop out. You're processing the information on the ignored ear enough, the meaning of the ignored information in this ear enough that you can still recognize your name when it happens. So the researcher would say, did you notice anything unusual in the ear that you were ignoring? They'd be like, yeah, I heard my name over there. So that's evidence for this late selection theory. Another cool example is people would hear, they would be shadowing something in this ear, repeating everything they heard in this ear. And then over here in the ear they ignored, they would hear one of 2 things. They would either hear about a riverbank, or they would hear about the other type of bank, which would be, like a money bank. Those are the 2 types of bank. So in the ear that they're ignoring, they're not paying attention to this ear. It would be like a story about people that went to the river to go fishing, the riverbank. They're sitting on the riverbank and they're going fishing or something like that. Or they would hear in the ignored ear, people went to the bank to deposit their paycheck. So those are like one of the 2 things. You'd hear one thing or the other in this ear. And then when you're done, the researcher gives you this sentence. So you're taking the earphones off, and the researcher says, interpret this sentence. They were standing near the bank. And notice that this sentence is kind of ambiguous. You have the word bank here, but it's not clear in this sentence what type of bank they were standing near. And it could be one of the two types. It either could be a river bank or it could be the money bank. And it turns out that whatever you heard in this ignored ear, if you heard something about the river bank in the ignored ear, that increases the likelihood statistically that you will say, oh, they were standing near a river bank. Or if you heard about the money bank in the ignored ear, and the same thing for that. The researcher asks, what kind of bank were they standing near? Whatever happened in that ignored ear, whether it was talking about a river bank or a money bank, whatever happened there influences the likelihood that you will respond to the type of bank that the people were standing near, say money or a river bank. And so what this suggests, in order to, that's once again, the ability to differentiate whether something is a money bank or a river bank, that requires kind of processing the meaning of the words. You have to process the words themselves, the meaning of those words. You're ignoring it. Nevertheless, the meaning of those words in the ignored ear is influencing your interpretation of this sentence right here. So these two theories are in competition, and there's it's not clear which one is right. In fact, they're probably both right, but there's different studies that support the early selection theory, and then there's different studies that support the late selection theory. So that's where I want to end today. We'll start with we'll get to more of the cognitive neuroscience of attention next time. So call it a day there. I know I've been going long, so we won't go quite as long today. I did post that Master's Emissary lecture. Take a look at that if you would like. And I will be posting a quiz that we'll be doing a week from today later this afternoon. Take care.